It's funny how we are conditioned to measure the health of an entire nation. If you really think about it, there's this underlying expectation of absolute precision, almost like we are standing in a hospital room reading a heart monitor, right?
Yeah, that's exactly how we treat it. We want that instant read.
Right. You flip open the news, you look at the financial headlines, and, well, what do you see? You see the gross domestic product dropping by some specific percentage. You see the local currency depreciating against the dollar. And the economic analysts on television, they just point at that jagged red line on the screen and say, there it is, the definitive proof the country is failing.
It is incredibly common. I mean, we treat national success as a simple binary. It is a very clean, absolute narrative, rich or poor, growing or crashing. There's really no in-between in the public consciousness.
Exactly. And honestly, I think we crave that simplicity. It's comforting to have a single number tell us the whole story. We want the sheer complexity of millions of human lives to be perfectly, I don't know, categorized by the immediate numbers in our bank accounts or the stock market ticker.
But the reality is that we gravitate toward what is highly visible and updated daily. The stock market ticks every single second. But human development, the actual physical lived experience of a society that moves at a much different, much quieter pace.
Yeah.
And when you start looking at those slower, deeper metrics, that financial heart monitor narrative, it often falls completely apart.
Which brings us to the core of our deep dive today. So, welcome. If you are joining us, you are the kind of listener who wants to look past those noisy panic headlines to find out how the world actually works. And today we are staring at a massive, and I mean floor-to-ceiling massive stack of United Nations data.
Spanning 33 years, right? From 1990 all the way to 2023.
Right. And our mission today is to solve a modern paradox, because we are looking at Argentina.
And it is the absolute definition of a developmental paradox. I mean, it really throws a wrench in standard economic theory.
Because for the casual observer, for anyone who just casually scrolls through global news, Argentina's brand right now, and frankly for the past couple of decades, is clouded by this intense, overwhelming economic fog.
Oh, absolutely. The narrative is very fixed.
You have seen the headlines. It's relentless, punishing inflation, historic debt defaults, currency crises where prices literally change at the grocery store while you were walking down the aisle. The macroeconomic anxiety is just palpable.
Precisely. If your entire worldview is dictated by macroeconomic indicators, you look at Argentina and you see a story of severe, often violent volatility. You see a system constantly teetering on the brink.
But here's where it gets incredibly fascinating. When you strip away that macroeconomic anxiety, when you force yourself to stop looking at the fluctuating value of the peso and look purely at the United Nations human development metrics over the last 3 decades, Argentina is quietly pulling off a sociological miracle.
It really is.
It feels like we are looking at a parallel universe.
It forces us to ask a very uncomfortable question for economists. Can you actually separate the health of an economy from the health of a society?
Yeah.
Because the data, this 33-year UN data set suggests that under certain conditions, you absolutely can.
Okay, so to help you, the listener, really conceptualize this parallel universe, I want you to imagine a chart, just a simple visual graph in your mind. Imagine a pure white background, okay? Very clean. And on this chart, there are 2 lines tracking the last 33 years.
Right, the dual narrative.
Yeah. The first line is this thin, jagged, gray dashed line that represents the macroeconomy. It is violently zigzagging. It peaks, it drops off a cliff, it spikes back up, it crashes again. It is pure chaos. But slicing right through the middle of that chaotic gray line is a second line.
The blue line.
Yes, exactly. A thick, steady, calm, Morandi blue line. And it is trending reliably, undeniably upward.
And that steady blue line is Argentina's Human Development Index, the HDI. It acts as if the gray line of the economy doesn't even exist, which is, well, it's wild to look at.
It completely defies gravity. So I need you to explain the mechanics of this to me, because we're going to dive into 4 specific dimensions of this today. First, that indestructible HDI foundation. Second, this crazy gender equality shift. Third, the hidden toll of income inequality. And fourth, a massive secret green dividend.
That's the roadmap, yeah.
But before we get into the exact numbers of that first dimension, what exactly is the UN measuring with that blue line? If they aren't just looking at the GDP, what is the actual formula for the Human Development Index?
Right. So to understand the HDI, we have to go back to why it was created in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
For a long time, the global community just used gross national income, or GNI, to rank countries. If you had a lot of money, you were a quote-unquote developed country.
Basically just looking at the size of the national wallet.
Exactly. But the UN realized that money is just a means to an end. It doesn't actually tell you if people are living good lives. So they designed the HDI as a composite index built on 3 distinct pillars.
Okay, 3 pillars. Walk me through them.
The first pillar is a long and healthy life, which they measure by life expectancy at birth. Very straightforward. The second pillar is access to knowledge.
So education.
Right. And they measure this using 2 metrics. The expected years of schooling for a child just entering the system, and the mean years of schooling for adults who have already been through it. And then the third pillar is a decent standard of living, which is where they finally factor in the gross national income per capita.
So income is in there, but it is only 1/3 of the final score.
Correct. It's a much broader scorecard for human flourishing. It dilutes the power of pure cash.
I love that. It dilutes the power of pure cash.
And when we apply that scorecard to Argentina over our 33-year data set, the results are stunning. That steady blue line of the HDI grew from 0.733 back in 1990 to a highly impressive 0.865 in 2023.
To give the listener some context on that 0.865 number, because, decimals can be a bit abstract, that places Argentina 47th globally out of nearly 200 countries. The UN officially categorizes it as a country with very high human development.
Which is the top tier.
It is, but I have to push back here. I am trying to wrap my head around the mechanics of this.
Yeah.
How is steady growth mathematically possible when the economy keeps stumbling? I mean, how does it just ignore the gray line?
The best way to understand the mechanics is to subject this data to a stress test. We need to look at what happens to that blue line when the gray line hits absolute rock bottom. Let's zoom in on a very specific, incredibly painful moment in the data, the 2002 Argentine economic crisis.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I remember reading about 2002. It was catastrophic.
It really was.
The country literally defaulted on its sovereign debt. The banking system completely froze. People couldn't get their own cash out of the banks. The currency was drastically devalued overnight.
Yeah.
If we go back to our mental graph, 2002 is where the gray economic line basically falls straight down into an abyss.
It was a massive, sudden contraction of national wealth. To give you the exact UN figures from our data set for that specific year, the gross national income per capita plummeted. The female GNI dropped to roughly $12,129, and the male GNI dropped to $23,397.
So the wealth simply evaporated.
Exactly. It just vanished.
Right. So if one of the 3 pillars of the Human Development Index is income, and the income evaporates, the overall HDI score should plummet too, right? That's just basic math.
That is the logical assumption, but it didn't. When you look at the overall HDI for 2002, it barely flinched. It sat at 0.795.
Wait, really?
Yeah. That is a microscopic, almost statistical error level dip from the year prior. And the very next year, it immediately resumed its upward trajectory as if the economic collapse had never even happened.
I'm sorry, you have to explain how that works. If one of the legs of a 3-legged stool gets kicked out, the stool falls over. How did the HDI survive a literal historic economic collapse?
Because of the immense durable weight of the other 2 pillars, education and life expectancy. You have to think about the physical mechanics of human capital. What happens in a currency devaluation? You lose your income overnight. Your savings account might lose 70% of its purchasing power.
Right.
But you do not lose the knowledge stored inside your brain.
Oh, wow. Okay, I see where you're going with this.
Right. If you are an engineer, a currency collapse doesn't make you forget how to build a bridge. If you are a teacher, you don't forget how to read. And crucially, the public health infrastructure that the state spent decades building, the water treatment plants, the vaccination protocols, the physical hospitals, those don't instantly vanish into thin air just because the bond market is panicking.
I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly because that is profound. It is like looking at a house where the homeowner's bank account has suddenly been zeroed out by a hacker. The cash is entirely gone. But the structural foundation of the house itself is made of titanium.
Exactly.
The wealth in the bank evaporated, but the walls of the house are still standing, the roof isn't leaking, the heating works, and the people inside are still perfectly healthy and reading books.
That is a brilliant analogy. The HDI measures the house, not just the bank account. And Argentina's structural foundation is incredibly robust. Let's look at the actual numbers for those titanium foundations over this 33-year period to see why they anchor the score so heavily. Let's take the first pillar, life expectancy.
And keep in mind, listener, this is happening across 3 decades of supposed economic instability.
Right. Despite all the economic turmoil from 1990 to 2023, Female life expectancy in Argentina rose from 71.6 years overall in 1990 to 77.4 years in 2023. And if we break that down by gender, which the data does, female life expectancy went from 74.8 years to nearly 80 years, 79.8 to be exact. Men went from 68.3 years to almost 75 years, hitting 74.8.
So if we look at that, that is roughly an extra 6 years of life added per citizen across the entire population. 6 extra years of breathing, living, existing, while the macroeconomic headlines are screaming that the country is failing. That takes massive, sustained public health coordination.
It really does.
Yeah.
It requires systemic prenatal care, disease prevention, and geriatric care that survives political administrations and economic downturns. It's a compounding interest of public health.
Yeah.
But the knowledge engine, the education pillar, is arguably even more robust. Let's look at the mean years of schooling. Remember, this metric measures the average number of years of education actually received by people ages 25 and older.
Okay, so the adults who have already gone through the system. The finished product, essentially.
Correct. For women, it went from 8.0 years in 1990 to 11.45 years in 2023.
Wow.
That is an absolute gain of almost 3.5 years of actual physical time spent inside a classroom by the average adult female. The male population saw similar structural gains.
This brings up a really profound philosophical question that I want you, the listener, to mull over for a second. What truly makes a country wealthy? We're so trained to think of wealth as cash flow, as GDP, as the strength of a currency on the foreign exchange market.
Right, the gray line.
Exactly. But if you have a society where the undeniable physical reality is that citizens are surviving 6 years longer, learning for 3 more years, and retaining that knowledge regardless of the national cash flow, I mean, isn't that a form of wealth that is actually far more real than fiat currency?
It absolutely challenges our traditional capital-driven definition of progress. What the data shows is that historical state investment in human beings provides a shock absorber. When the private market fails or the currency stumbles, the societal floor holds. The foundation doesn't crack.
But I want to pivot here because this brings us to the second dimension of our framework. When we look closer at that education data, the UN data set reveals something that I honestly had to read 3 times to believe.
Yeah, the gender metrics are mind-blowing.
We know the society is educating people. But when we transition from the general population to specific demographics, when we ask who exactly is sitting in those classrooms, the data completely shatters all traditional expectations.
Yes. We need to introduce the Gender Development Index, or GDI. This metric is specifically designed to measure gender gaps in those same human development achievements. It takes the HDI and splits it by gender to see if women and men are progressing equally in health, knowledge, and living standards.
And when you map out the Argentine GDI over our 33-year timeline, it is practically a straight, flat line at the very top of the chart. It hovers tightly between 0.971 in 1990 and 0.988 in 2023. Now, in this index, a score of 1.0 means perfect, absolute equality between men and women. So they're effectively at parity.
They are.
But perfect parity isn't the whole story. The breakdown of the education metric within that index is the real shocker.
This is where we see an incredible counterintuitive triumph. We have to look at a submetric called expected years of schooling. Unlike mean years of schooling, which looks at adults, expected years of schooling calculates the total number of years of education that a young child entering the school system today can expect to receive in their lifetime based on current enrollment rates.
Okay, so this is projecting the future of the youth based on the current infrastructure.
Exactly. In 1990, the expected years of schooling for females was 14.2 years, and for males, it was 12.6 years. So even 30 years ago, women were slightly ahead. But fast forward to 2023.
I'm looking at these exact numbers, and it is just staggering. By 2023, the expected years of schooling for women reached 20.75 years. Let me just repeat that. Almost 21 years of expected education. Meanwhile, men are sitting at 16.99 years.
The disparity is massive.
I have to stop and unpack this mechanically because 21 years of school is an eternity. If a child starts school at age 4 or 5, 21 years of education means they aren't just finishing high school. They aren't just finishing a 4-year college degree. A 21-year expectation implies that the average girl starting school in Argentina today is statistically expected to pursue a master's degree or extensive postgraduate professional training.
It does.
How is a country with a famously struggling economy funding a 21-year educational pipeline for its female population?
It is a testament to the structural legacy of public education in the country. Argentina has a long-standing tradition of free, unrestricted access to public universities. The state absorbs the cost of that higher education. But sociologically, what's fascinating here is how this completely shatters traditional stereotypes of Latin American societal structures.
Right. Historically, if you read sociological texts about Latin America from the mid-20th century, they are often painted with this broad brush of machismo, characterized by male dominance in public life and female relegation to the domestic sphere.
That stereotype is entirely obliterated by this data. In Argentina's educational sphere, women haven't just caught up to men in the long march toward equality. They have completely lapsed them. They have created a nearly 4-year gap in expected educational tenure.
And it isn't just an educational phenomenon. This structural shift is bleeding into other areas of society, isn't it?
It is. To see the full picture, we must look at a companion metric, the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII. Now, while the GEI measures achievements, the GII measures the loss in potential human development due to inequality between female and male achievements. It looks at 3 specific areas: reproductive health, empowerment, and the labor market.
And the GII data shows a massive steep drop in inequality. Over our 33-year timeline, the inequality index plummeted by 46%. It went from a highly unequal score of 0.489 in 1990 all the way down to a much more equitable 0.264 in 2023.
A key mechanical driver of that steep decline is reproductive health. You cannot have women staying in the educational system for 21 years if they are facing systemic health crises.
That makes total sense. What does the health data actually show?
Well, the maternal mortality ratio, which tracks deaths per 100,000 live births, has seen historic drops. It's stabilized around 44.9 recently. But more importantly for the education pipeline, if we look at the deeper demographics, adolescent birth rates experienced a cliff-edge drop. This measures births per 1,000 women between the ages of 15 and 19.
Okay, teenage pregnancies.
Right. In 1990, it was 70.3. By 2023, it plummeted to just 26.4.
Wow. That is a massive public health victory. And mechanically, we can draw a direct line between that number and the 21 years of expected schooling. If you protect young women from early unintended pregnancies, they aren't forced to drop out of high school to become teenage mothers. They stay in the system. They go to university. They get those master's degrees.
Exactly. The policies empower them to control their timelines. And that educational empowerment naturally spills over into political empowerment. The data shows women holding nearly 43.7% of parliamentary seats in 2023, up from just 22% back in 1990. They have essentially doubled their presence in the highest legislative body.
So if we look at the classroom and the halls of government, women are dominating. The political and educational spheres have been historically democratized.
They have. It is a profound structural improvement.
Okay, I'm going to play the skeptic here because as much as I love a victory lap, there is a glaring, massive contradiction staring at us in this GDI data set.
I think I know where you're going with this.
We have been praising the 21 years of education, but I'm looking at the income column for 2023. If women are spending nearly 21 years in the education system, if they're securing master's degrees and dominating the universities, if they represent almost half of the national parliament.
Why aren't they getting paid?
Exactly. Why is the female gross national income per capita in 2023 still only $19,464, while the male GNI is a massive $32,385?
That is the exact right question to ask. You have identified what sociologists and economists call the workplace paradox.
A $13,000 income gap. That is an enormous disparity for a demographic that has 4 more years of formal education than their male counterparts. How is that functionally possible?
It reveals a frustrating reality. The data shows that while the classroom and the parliament have been successfully democratized, the labor market remains the last mile of the gender equality marathon, and it is a mile covered in systemic hurdles. Despite being vastly more educated, female labor force participation is only 53.16%.
Only 53%, so almost half of these highly educated women are not even participating in the formal labor market.
Correct. Compare that to the male labor force participation rate, which sits at 72.22%.
So women are getting the degrees, but they aren't translating those degrees into paychecks. Why? If the state is providing the education, why isn't the market using it?
Because the market does not exist in a cultural vacuum. This points to systemic, often invisible issues outside of the classroom. We're talking about unpaid care work. Traditional domestic roles stubbornly persist, dictating that women, regardless of their educational attainment, are primarily responsible for raising children and caring for the elderly. We are also looking at a labor market that often subtly or overtly penalizes women for taking time off for family planning, leading to a loss in seniority and earning power.
It's like the state is doing its job perfectly. It has built this incredible machine to generate human capital. The schools are churning out highly capable, brilliant women, but the private economic system is just dropping the ball. It is failing to fully absorb, utilize, and reward that human capital.
That is precisely the bottleneck. The potential has been generated, but the economic structure restricts its flow.
And honestly, that bottleneck is the perfect bridge into the third dimension of our deep dive. Up until now, we've been talking about the glossy, steady blue line of the HDI. We have talked about the titanium foundations. Now, we have to talk about the reality check. We have to look at the dark side of the data.
Yes. It is time to introduce the Inequality-Adjusted Human Development Index, or the IHDI.
I find this metric absolutely fascinating because it is basically the UN playing the role of a ruthless auditor. If the standard HDI is the beautiful, glossy real estate brochure showing you a perfect house, the IHDI is the home inspector's report that tells you about the mold in the basement.
That is very apt comparison. You see, the standard HDI has a significant blind spot. It relies on averages. It assumes that human development, the health, the education, the wealth, is distributed perfectly equally across the entire population. But we know from history and reality that this is never true. Resources are always skewed.
Right. If you have 1 billionaire and 9 people with $0, the average wealth is still $100 million each, which looks great on paper, but 9 people are still starving.
Exactly. The IHDI mathematically adjusts the HDI score based on the actual level of inequality within a country. If a society is perfectly equal, the HDI and the IHDI will be the exact same number. But as inequality within the population rises, the IHDI score gets dragged down below the standard HDI. The percentage difference between the two numbers represents the loss to potential human development caused by that inequality.
And for Argentina, that auditor's report is painful. In 2023, the ideal HDI, the glossy brochure, was 0.865. But when you apply the UN's inequality adjustment, the reality check IHDI drops all the way down to 0.761. That represents an overall loss of 12.02%.
A 12% loss in human potential is significant. To truly understand what is dragging the country down, we have to act like detectives and deconstruct that 12% loss. The UN breaks down this inequality into the same 3 foundational pillars: education, life expectancy, and income.
So we need to find the culprit. Let's look at the 2023 data. Is the loss coming from an unequal education system? Are only the elites getting to go to school?
The data says no. The inequality in education metric is remarkably low. It contributes only a 4.9% loss to the overall score.
So the vast majority of people, regardless of class, have relatively equal access to those public schools and universities we were just praising. The education system is structurally fair.
Correct. Okay, then we check the second pillar. Is it unequal healthcare access? Are only the wealthy citizens living to see 80 years old while the poor die young?
Again, looking at the data set, the answer is no. The inequality in life expectancy is also exceptionally low, sitting at just 7.39%. So structurally, the hospitals, the clinics, the public health initiatives are successfully reaching a broad spectrum of the population.
Which leaves us with a final pillar by process of elimination. The true vampire sucking away the development gains of Argentina is purely income inequality.
And the number is brutal. The income inequality sits at a glaring 22.59%. It is the absolute anchor dragging the entire national score down.
What this tells us on a macro-sociological level is that the Argentine state excels at providing public goods, health, and knowledge, but struggles immensely, almost fatally, with private wealth distribution.
I want to paint a picture for you, the listener, to really help internalize how bizarre this structural reality is. I want you to imagine a society. In the center of the town, there is a beautiful, perfectly egalitarian public library. Anyone from any background can walk in, grab a book, study, and get a master's degree. Right next door is a world-class public hospital. It treats everyone who walks through the doors equally, extending everyone's life by 6 years. The public goods are distributed incredibly fairly.
That represents the low inequality in education and health.
Right. But I want you to look out the window of that library at the parking lot outside. That parking lot is entirely violently polarized. Half the people who just used that free library arrived in luxury yachts or armored luxury SUVs, and the other half walked there barefoot in the rain because they couldn't afford a bicycle.
It perfectly highlights a severe economic bottleneck. This society guarantees you will live to be nearly 80 years old. It guarantees you can get a world-class university education.
Yeah.
But it absolutely does not guarantee that you can translate that long, highly educated life into personal financial wealth. The wealth concentration at the top remains stubbornly, rigidly high.
Which is sadly a very common trait in Latin American economic histories.
Yes, deep-rooted historical wealth concentration is a regional hallmark.
Mm.
But what makes Argentina unique is that this extreme private wealth hoarding exists right alongside top-tier, universally accessed public educational achievements.
Okay, but understanding this extreme 22% income inequality brings up a logical, honestly terrifying follow-up question. I am going to push back again. If income inequality is a massive 22.59%, and we know from the very beginning of this conversation that the macroeconomy is constantly battling hyperinflation that destroys everyday purchasing power,
Right.
doesn't that mathematically mean that millions of these citizens, even the highly educated ones, are living in absolute starving poverty?
That is the natural, logical assumption anyone would make. If the money is hoarded at the top and the currency is losing value, the bottom must be falling out. But this is where the Argentine data stack throws us yet another massive curveball. To answer your question, we have to look at our fourth metric, the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MPI.
I have to admit, when we were prepping for this deep dive, I found this specific index to be the most fascinating part of the UN's methodology, because poverty is a loaded word. In colloquial conversation, we usually just think of poverty as a lack of cash, the classic living on less than $2 a day metric.
And for a long time, that was the only way economists measured it. But the UN recognized that cash is only one dimension of human suffering. The MPI looks beyond income to understand how people experience poverty in multiple, simultaneous, overlapping ways in their daily lives.
How does it measure that? What are the specific indicators?
It looks at three broad dimensions: health, education, and standard of living, and breaks them down into 10 very specific, tangible indicators. We are talking about things like child mortality, basic nutrition, whether a home has a dirt floor, access to electricity, clean drinking water, basic sanitation, and safe cooking fuel. If a person is deprived in a third or more of these weighted indicators, the UN classifies them as living in multidimensional poverty. It's a measure of absolute physical destitution.
Okay, so keeping in mind the 22% income inequality and the crashing peso, when you look at the MPI data for Argentina from the 2019-2020 UN survey, what is the poverty rate?
The MPI head count, which is the percentage of the population living in this absolute multidimensional destitution, is a microscopic 0.4%.
I'm sorry, I have to stop you. Less than half of 1%. I see the news footage. People are carrying stacks of cash just to buy basic groceries. You are telling me that absolute poverty is less than 0.5%? That sounds impossible. Defend that data to me. How is that mathematically viable?
I completely understand the skepticism. It sounds like a contradiction. To understand it, we have to unpack what makes up that tiny 0.4%. When you look at the internal contribution to that microscopic poverty rate, what little multidimensional poverty exists is primarily driven by health factors. Specifically, nutrition contributes 35.8% to that fraction, and child mortality contributes 33.8%.
Okay, those are serious issues, often tied directly to cash flow for food.
Exactly. But I want you to look at the infrastructural components of poverty, the physical environment that people live in.
Only look at the breakdown. This is where the numbers get crazy. The lack of safe cooking fuel contributes only 0.2% to the poverty index. Lack of electricity, 0.2%. Lack of drinking water, 0.3%.
Do you see what that implies?
It implies that practically everyone has water and power.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it suggests that Argentina has effectively built an infrastructural immunity system against absolute multidimensional poverty.
An immunity system. I really like that framing. Unpack that for me.
Think about it historically. Because of decades of public works and massive state investment in the electrical grid, water sanitation pipelines, and basic housing infrastructure, the floor of human destitution has been artificially, permanently raised.
So even if the macroeconomic weather is a hurricane, the physical house keeps you dry.
Precisely. Even if a citizen has very little income, even if their paycheck is being eaten alive by inflation the very moment they receive it, the state's foundational infrastructure prevents them from falling back into the dark ages.
Yeah.
You don't lose your running water just because the peso dropped against the dollar today.
Let me make sure I am grasping the reality of this. You can be cash poor. Your wallet might literally be empty. You might be struggling to afford premium proteins at the market because of inflation, but you are still permanently plugged into the modern 21st century grid. You flip a switch on the wall and the lights come on. You turn the tap in your kitchen and clean drinkable water comes out. Your home has a solid floor and an indoor toilet. The state has built a physical safety net made of copper wire and PVC pipes that catches you before you hit the dirt.
That is exactly what the data reveals. It completely recontextualizes the income inequality data we discussed earlier. Yes, the private financial wealth at the top is hoarded by a few. And yes, chronic inflation makes the middle and lower classes feel constantly economically insecure and anxious, but the baseline dignity of modern human living, electricity, water, sanitation, and as we discussed, education is practically universal.
It really is an invisible infrastructure, isn't it? It is humming along, working silently in the background, keeping millions of people out of absolute destitution, while the politicians argue on television about interest rates. It is a massive sociological achievement that the financial headlines entirely miss when they only focus on sovereign debt yields.
It is the quiet resilience of a developed state.
All right, this has been an incredible journey so far. We have covered the indestructible nature of the HDI. We have looked at the massive gender reversal where women are dominating the 21-year education pipeline. We faced the reality check of severe income inequality, and we just unpacked the infrastructural immunity system that prevents absolute poverty. We are at our fourth dimension in this one.
This is the hidden global trump card.
It is arguably the most surprising metric in the entire UN dataset, because usually when a country achieves a very high human development score of 0.865, and when it successfully connects nearly 99% of its 46 million citizens to a robust modern power and water grid, it requires a massive, devastating ecological toll. Right. Historically, the traditional path to a high HDI is paved with coal. It requires rampant resource extraction, deforestation, and massive carbon emissions. That is the classic global north model. You get rich, you get educated, and you get electrified by burning the planet. So the natural question is, did Argentina trade its environment for its human development?
To answer that, the UN recently introduced a brilliant, highly revealing metric called the Planetary Pressures Adjusted HDI, or the PHDI.
Okay, explain the methodology of the PHDI.
It takes a country's standard HDI development score, all that great data on health, wealth, and education, and it actively penalizes it based on two environmental factors: carbon dioxide emissions per capita and material footprint per capita.
It is essentially an ecological tax. The UN is applying a penalty fee to your development score based on how much damage you did to the Earth to achieve it.
Precisely. And for many wealthy, highly developed nations, the countries we usually consider the gold standard of success applying the PHDI is an absolute bloodbath. Their global rankings plummet because their human development is heavily artificially subsidized by aggressive ecological extraction. But when this environmental adjustment is applied to Argentina,
They experience what we can call a massive green premium.
they do. While Argentina's standard HDI rank is a respectable 47th in the world, the moment you adjust for planetary pressures, its PHDI rank jumps up a staggering 22 places. It leaps to the 25th spot globally.
A rank jump of 22 places. That is unheard of. Let me look at the specific data points causing that leap. The material footprint per capita in 2023 was highly constrained at just 16.329 tons per capita. And the carbon emissions are remarkably low for a nation with such deep universal infrastructure penetration. I'm seeing 4.2 tons. This low ecological demand results in a nearly 11.79% positive difference from its standard HDI value.
What is truly fascinating here is the deep irony of the global development narrative. The wealthier, quote-unquote, stable nations of the global north frequently point to countries experiencing inflation, like Argentina, as prime examples of mismanagement. Yet, when the planet's health is factored into the ledger of success, those stable economies free fall in the rankings because their success is ecologically unsustainable. Argentina, on the other hand, is achieving top 25 global human development under the PHDI, ensuring long lives, universal education, and power grids with a remarkably light touch on the Earth.
Let's use an analogy here. It is like looking at two students in a chemistry class. The global north is the student who got an A+ on their final project, but to get that A+, they completely trashed the laboratory, broke all the beakers, and started a chemical fire.
Yeah.
Argentina is the student who got an A- on the project, but they did it using only recycled materials and left the lab perfectly clean. One is slightly richer on paper, but the other is infinitely more sustainable.
That is a perfect encapsulation. It proves mathematically that the correlation between high human development and high planetary pressure is not an unbreakable law of physics. It can be decoupled. You can build the titanium foundation without burning down the forest.
It is basically an ecological miracle wrapped in a financial crisis. Okay, let's take a breath and unpack everything we've discovered today. We started this deep dive looking at a country deeply clouded by an economic fog. The daily headlines scream about inflation, debt, and macroeconomic chaos. But by looking strictly at 3 decades of UN data, we stripped away that fog entirely.
And beneath that fog, we found a highly resilient, deeply entrenched social architecture.
We found a country where women are radically out-educating men, statistically expected to spend nearly 21 years in the school system, defying every outdated cultural stereotype. We found a physical infrastructure so robust that it acts as an immunity system, guaranteeing water and power and protecting the poorest citizens from absolute multidimensional destitution, even when their cash incomes evaporate. And we found that they're doing all of this while maintaining an impressively small ecological footprint, earning them a massive green premium on the global stage.
Now we must acknowledge the flaws. Despite the persistent, undeniable tax of severe income inequality and the workplace paradox holding women back from their full earning potential, the core foundation of the society remains incredibly strong.
It changes the entire narrative. Argentina isn't a failing state. It is a sociological honor student trapped in a turbulent economy. It is an invisible infrastructure maniac quietly building resilient citizens while the world only watches its bank account.
Which leaves us with a necessary, perhaps provocative, philosophical question to mull over as we conclude. For decades, the global community has rigidly used gross domestic product, the strength of a fiat currency, and the performance of stock markets as the ultimate scorecard for whether a country is good or successful.
The financial heart monitor we talked about at the very beginning of the show.
Exactly. But if a nation can endure relentless multi-decade inflation and severe currency crises, yet still ensure its citizens live 6 to 8 years longer, guarantee its women 20 years of education, practically eradicate multidimensional physical poverty, and demand far less from the earth than its wealthier peers, do we need to fundamentally redefine what a successful country actually looks like?
Is the heart monitor measuring the wrong organ entirely? Are we so obsessed with the wallet that we are ignoring the mind and the body? That is a thought I want you to take with you today. Thank you for taking this deep dive with us into the UN data. The next time you see a panicked headline about a country in crisis, remember to look for the steady blue line beneath the zigzagging gray one. Take care.